I think that is a prediction that we'd like to revisit at this point, because I think what we're seeing now in Facebook or Meta is definitely saying this, that the impact of app tracking transparency and iOS changes is enormous.
Hey gang, it's Thursday, May 5th. Andrew, Debbie and listeners, welcome to the Behind the Numbers Daily, an eMarketer podcast made possible by mParticle. I'm Marcus. Today I'm joined by two folks. Let's meet them. We start with our principal analyst who covers everything retail and e-commerce. It's Andrew Lipsman.
Hey, Marcus.
Hey, chap. And we're also joined by our principal analyst who heads up our social media practice. It's Deborah Aho-Williamson.
Hey, Marcus.
Hey, Debbie. Today's fact. America is home to some of the world's largest employers. Maybe unsurprisingly, but who are they? Do you guys want to take a guess? Can you guess one of the top 10 employers in terms of people that they employ in the world? Could you name the 4 companies, or organizations, I should say? The 4 US organizations that make the top 10 largest employers list.
In my world, Amazon and Walmart have to be at or near the top of the list.
Amazon
I was about to say
in.
Amazon and Walmart.
Yep, Amazon and Walmart both are, yeah. So you've got Walmart is the 3rd largest in the world, but it's the 2nd largest American firm. So I'll go in order. America has 4 of the top 10 largest employers in the world. The US Department of Defense, it's not a company, it's an organization, is the number 1 in the world, employing nearly 3 million people. Walmart is the next largest American employer. It's 3rd in the world, employing 2.2 million. Then McDonald's with 1.9 million. That makes them 7th in the world. And Amazon sneaks into the top 10, 10th with 1.6 million. A few years ago, they were nowhere near the top 10, but they've been, as you guys well know, hiring at a just insane clip. The rest of the top 10 are Chinese organizations, China's People's Liberation Army, China Rail, companies like that, organizations like that. The only employer in the top 10 who's not a US or Chinese organization is the UK's National Health Service, employing 1.7 million people. Anyway, today's real topic: how sturdy are the 3 legs of Meta's advertising stool? All right, folks, for today's episodes, we're talking about how Meta's doing and how sturdy are things really coming off the bat of earnings. So we'll talk a bit about those, but zooming out from those, because we covered them in yesterday's episode, how do things look more longer term, short, medium and longer term, I guess, for Meta, for Facebook more specifically, and other parts of the business. Andrew, back on December 20th, 2021, we had a very specific 2022 predictions episode, and you predicted that Facebook would soon start to struggle, that you were noticing some inconsistencies in the numbers and you had some concerns. As Laura Foreman of the Wall Street Journal puts it, just a few months ago, Mark Zuckerberg was bobbing around in the metaverse as a legless avatar. Today, in the real world, his company is staring at a roughly $200 billion loss in market value. So Andrew, let's rewind 5 or 6 months. What were you seeing at the time when we did that very specific predictions episode? And you said that you're not too sure about how steady Facebook really is, specifically in Meta more broadly. You were suggesting that something was up, but what to you was the canary in the coal mine?
Well, we were already starting to see and hear about the iOS headwinds, and we knew that was going to start to have some impact on monetization, which is one of the key pieces here of the business. But the one that I was really kind of focusing my prediction on was the decline. I was predicting a decline in users. Mm-hmm. And obviously the market and social media companies has always kind of looked first at user trends. And really what I was seeing or predicting at the time was that I had been looking at a fair amount of third-party research data that was showing more indications of decline in Facebook's business, whether it was monthly active users or time spent declines. And it wasn't showing up quite yet in Facebook's reported earnings, but I felt like at some point they could only continue to diverge for so long and that we'd start to see it show its face in earnings. And then obviously that happened with the Q4 results.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we saw the first ever decline in users for Facebook. And Let's go through the highlights quickly, just to kind of set the table in terms of where we are today. So that's how you're feeling then. The Q1 numbers are now out. So the user highlights there, 2 billion people worldwide use Facebook every day. Facebook added 31 million daily active users in Q1, the same number that they added in Q1 2021, which is obviously, as we just said, it's coming off the back of that first ever user decline. Last quarter and this quarter, they were up 31 million. 2/3 of that came from Asia, the rest pretty much from rest of world. North America added 1 million, Europe fell by 2 million. So that's what happened. Revenue-wise, Meta made over $27 billion in Q1, but that was up just 6% on last Q1. It's the slowest revenue growth since Facebook went public in 2012. Last Q1, 2021 revenue had grown 46%. So this Q1's growth compared to last year was 7 times slower. Nearly half of the money Meta makes, 45%, still comes from North America, but that was barely up 1%. Europe was flat, rest of world and Asia, 20% each. Debbie, I'll come to you first. How did the Q1 earnings sit with you?
Well, I mean, I think it was definitely mixed. So the good news, and I think the news that most everybody in the press and probably in the stock market took away, was that Meta did not report yet another decline in daily active users. So if they had, that would have been really, really bad.
Yeah.
But they managed to somehow eke out growth in rest of world and Asia Pacific.
Were people expecting a fall, or were they expecting just not so great growth?
It depends on who you talk to.
Okay.
I think some people were expecting it to fall again in daily active users. And so I think what we would like to pay attention to is the markets US and North America, which is US and Canada and Europe, where the trends are really basically flat.
Yeah.
As far as revenue goes, I mean, the good news there was that the amount of revenue that Facebook was able to generate off of those users was, fairly solid. So again, the stock market was cheered by that, although the growth, as you noted, not great. And so we're really, I think, in a very new world order for Meta, and particularly for Facebook, in terms of how much it can grow, if it can grow in revenue or users.
Yeah. Yeah, and the BBC had noted analysts were saying the businesses are pulling back on advertising as they grapple with rising costs and economic uncertainty, stemming in part from the war in the Ukraine, but just the economic conditions in the US as well. So it's dealing with some of that stuff that a lot of other people in the digital ad space are dealing with. I want to zoom in on the users for 1 second, because as Debbie mentioned, Andrew, they were up a little bit by 1 million this quarter. And you'd mentioned that back December that you were concerned about those numbers. They had fallen in Q1, but now they're back up again. I'm wondering whether specifically in North America, we need to just reassess our thinking on what we should be expecting going forward, because North American new users has been stuck at 196 million for the last 2 years. Twitter has been stuck at 38 million for the last 2 years. Netflix has been stuck at 73 to 75 million for the last 4 or 5 quarters at least, particularly in North America. So it does seem like those companies are bumping up against that ceiling. Should that concern people as much if they're still squeezing out money? Or is this more of a question of, well, sure, those numbers aren't great, but international is also looking a bit bleak?
I don't think those numbers flatlining is a huge concern at this point. When you get to a certain level of saturation in a market, you don't really have a lot of room to continue to go upward. My source of concern is what happens if you start to get into the decline, right? Not just that you can't get higher in penetration, but it actually starts to reverse itself. Yeah. And I thought that last quarter might be the early signs of that. And frankly, what I'm looking at is some third-party data that's showing significant double-digit declines in time spent. So what I will say is this: third-party data does not really have daily active user numbers. So you have to triangulate a little bit in your analysis. But what they are showing in many cases is declining penetration of Facebook's app, and that some specific data that I was looking at from ComScore comparing total time spent on Facebook for all of 2021 was down 15% versus 2019, so pre-pandemic. So you're taking out those effects. So that's pretty significant, and that's going to correlate with daily active users. If you start to see the time spent decline by that much, it's only a matter of time before you start to see it show up in that daily active user metric. So those are the threads that I think are pulling. And in some sense, I think Facebook is a little bit further in its sort of usage decline overall than may be appreciated just by these daily active user metrics.
So let's press pause for a second and explain what you mean by the three legs of Meta's advertising stool, and then we'll take them in turn, because we're starting to get into one of them. So when you say that, what are the three legs?
Yeah, well, so the first leg is what we've focused a lot of the discussion on right now, which is usage, right? The ability to generate revenue is a function of how much time or how many visits people are doing on Facebook and Instagram. So usage is the first leg. The second leg is monetization, right? Of the impressions that I can deliver, how many of them can I deliver? And, what's the average pricing that I can get per impression? And as I mentioned, that right now is being affected by iOS, among some other things. And then the last leg of the stool, really, we can sort of broadly call it data, but maybe more specifically right now, commerce. So as Facebook has lost some of its signal and in behavioral data, there's an important initiative to ramp up its social commerce efforts and direct checkout on Facebook and Instagram. That provides really valuable first-party data signal that can be used to improve monetization for the ad business. So that's how we're looking at the three legs of the stool.
All right, let's pause there for a quick word from our sponsor, mParticle, and then when we come back, we will explain what we mean by the three legs of Meta's advertising stool, and we'll explore each one in turn. At the end of the day, your customer has to be at the center of everything you do. This starts with the right customer data strategy, as well as the right foundation to solve the challenges that typically inhibit success, such as data quality, data governance, and connectivity. mParticle is your real-time customer data infrastructure that helps you accelerate your data strategy by cleansing, visualizing, and integrating your customer data from anywhere to anywhere. Ultimately, better data leads to better decisions, better customer experiences, and better outcomes. See why the best brands choose mParticle. Go to www.mparticle.com. All right, so let's zoom back in on the first leg, users, because things could look concerning. It depends on how you're looking at it. Debbie, I mean, what's your take here? How concerned are you? Because if you look at, a worldwide level, they're nearly at 2 billion users daily, core of the population. In the US, it's still 196 million. They were at 195 in Q1 2020. So over the last 2 years, it's pretty much not budged, even though it has ticked down and ticked up a little bit. But then you look at the other side of it and you say, well, let's get a little bit more granular in terms of engagement and look at time spent. As Andrew said, some of those time spent numbers not looking so great. And we have our own time spent numbers. Facebook, about 31 minutes being spent on Facebook per day by Facebook users. That's compared to Snapchat, 30, Instagram at 29. Maybe what makes that number look so stagnant or so bad is that TikTok's at 38 million. So how do the user numbers and the usage numbers look to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think this might be a perfect segue to also talk about Instagram. Because when you talk about Meta, you really have to talk not only about Facebook, but also Instagram. Because there is increasing pressure on Meta to make sure that Instagram shows growth in revenue, in users, in time spent, in engagement, and all of these metrics. Because we're seeing flatness at Facebook in terms of daily active users, like you mentioned. And at this point, I mean, in our forecasts so far, Instagram is able to pick up the slack. We're forecasting, I think, about 4% growth in users. I think that's a monthly active figure. But at this point, Instagram is doing okay. There could be third-party metrics that Andrew might share that have different results. But at this point, with our forecasts, we're thinking that Instagram's doing okay. The other thing I think that would be interesting to look at is this idea of unduplicated users. So I can't reveal all the numbers yet because this forecast is literally just about ready to come out. But we have a new forecast for unduplicated users of Meta's two main platforms. And in that forecast, we estimate that about 2/3 of US internet users use either Facebook or Instagram in 2022. And that figure is going to be relatively unchanged. It was unchanged in the past 2 years and will continue to remain around that level for the next 2 years after this. So I think what that tells us, at least based on what our forecasters are saying, is that we think that even if Facebook were to experience some declines in usage, that Instagram Instagram would, be able to chug along okay and keep the lights on. Mm-hmm. Maybe that may be too negative of a term, but I think Instagram definitely has a lot of pressure on it right now.
And really quickly, Debbie, unduplicated, what do you mean by that?
Unduplicated meaning not counting twice, basically.
Yep.
So just to add color, the third-party data that I referenced before, so it was showing a 15% decline over the past 2 years at Facebook, plus 8% at Instagram. So Instagram is definitely helping counterbalance. But if you look at those two things together, right, it's still a net decline.
Yeah. Yeah, and looking at some of the user numbers to contrast Instagram against Facebook, we looked at our own forecast looking at American social network users. So of Americans who use social networks, 58% of them will use Instagram this year. And in 4 years' time, that goes from 58 today to 63%. But the opposite is happening at Facebook. This year, 80% of American social network users will use Facebook. And in 4 years' time, that will be 75%. Zooming in a bit more, we've still got the young people problem at Facebook specifically. 12 to 17-year-old social network users, 44% of them on Facebook today. In 4 years' time, 36%. That's down 8 points. The share of 18 to 24-year-old social network users in America on Facebook will also fall 8 points over the next 4 years to 52%. And the same with the 25 to 44s as well. That will also fall about 7 to 8 points over the next couple of years. It's the older users, which is sustaining Facebook's overall user base. But as Debbie has pointed out already, we talked about Instagram still belongs to Meta. So let's move to talking about revenue then, because Debbie, you mentioned that Instagram needs to pick up the slack, and there's a number which I found fascinating. We just recently broke out Meta in our ad numbers after they changed their name. We now have an ad revenue number for Meta, and a separate one for Facebook, a separate one for Instagram. And I was looking at Facebook's ad revenues, Facebook specifically, and Facebook's ad revenues in 2020 accounted for 55% of Meta's total. So Facebook accounted for 55% of Meta's total ad revenues in 2020. Today, it's 46%. And in another 2 years' time, it drops to 39%. So from 2020 to 2024, the amount of money that Facebook accounts for Meta total went from 55% and will head to 39%. So it is falling, and Instagram is going to need to pick up the slack. Andrew, are there any other signs that you're noticing with regards to your concern over Facebook, Meta, and the second leg of this stool, which is revenue?
Yeah, I've been paying close attention also to budget flows. So is there evidence that the dollars are starting to flow away from Meta into other budgets? And I have one data source from Rockerbox that I used in my recent D2C brands report that does show that Facebook has been losing share of D2C brands' ad budgets over the course of the past year since the iOS changes. And in a little bit more of a granular breakout, I thought this was really interesting. Looking at small brands, medium brands, and large brands, what you see is the biggest shifts in percentage of ad budget, digital ad budget, or rather, this is all ad budget. The most pronounced shifts were in small brands and large brands, whereas media brands actually kept their budgets on Facebook pretty stable. Mm-hmm. The small brands went from 58% of their budget on Facebook to 46% between Q1 2021 and Q1 2022. And then the large brands went from about 33% to about 24% on Facebook. So what's happening with the small brands? These are brands that are highly concentrated on Facebook and Google specifically, and not much else. So what happened there is that as their Facebook data really and ability to target got disrupted, they started to shift budgets where they could, which was often to Google. So you see almost a direct correlation between the loss in share at Facebook and the gain in share at Google. Mm-hmm. With large brands, they're already more diversified. They may be spending less in a bunch of different channels, and that could be offline media, other social platforms. So what seems to be happening with those larger D2C brands is that as their data signal gets disrupted, they're starting to shift into those other channels that they were already using. So their Google spend is actually staying stable, but their offline and other digital channels are seeing the gains that are coming out of Facebook.
Mm-hmm. Another thing affecting their revenue, we mentioned it quickly earlier, but Apple's iOS changes. So Meta still grappling with new privacy rules from Apple, making it harder to target ads. The company has said that changes could cost it $10 billion in lost sales this year. Folks, is this a small, medium, or big deal in terms of how affected Facebook, Meta has been and will continue to be by the changes that Apple made?
It's a huge deal. And I'm going to preface that, or maybe post it, not preface it, by saying when we published our social trends report, so this is an actual report. So I know we talked about Andrew's predictions, but we made a separate set of predictions in a report. And we did predict that Facebook would recover and that the impact of the Apple changes, the app tracking transparency, iOS changes would be minimal. I think that is a prediction that we'd like to revisit at this point, because I think what we're seeing now in Facebook or Meta is definitely saying this, that the impact of app tracking transparency and iOS changes is enormous. And it's impacting one of the largest segments of advertisers, the e-commerce advertisers that Andrew just alluded to. It's also affecting, obviously, any advertiser that wants to target people using iPhones. So we're seeing data sources like Tenuity, which just published in its Q1 2022 Facebook ads benchmark report, that iPhone spend growth was in negative territory in January 22 for the first time since the rollout of Apple's update back in April of last year.
Wow.
It stayed down year over year. Now, they've increased spending on Android among Tenuity's clients to make up for it, but iOS is a huge chunk of, obviously, of users. And so it's really impacting advertisers on Facebook, Meta's properties.
Yeah, and just to underscore this point, I mean, why are they doing it? I think it really comes down to the clarity that you get with measurement. When you see the numbers there in your ad systems, and all of a sudden the numbers, they were showing Facebook attributed revenue. If you're seeing those numbers down by a significant percentage, a lot of times 30, 40, 50%, it affects your thinking. It completely changes your return on ad spend calculation. And all of a sudden you're saying this channel is underperforming relative to other channels. So it just changes that calculus for anybody who's not taking a more holistic view. And I think especially this is true of smaller advertisers. They're oftentimes looking really strictly at the numbers, whereas, big brand advertisers may take a little bit more of a holistic view of things.
Mm-hmm. So as I mentioned, the company's saying that the changes, Meta saying the changes could cost it $10 billion in lost sales this year. What is $10 billion? How big of a deal is it? Well, that'll be 9% of all of the money that they made last year in ad revenue. So it could be wipe 9% off of last year's total revenue, or the equivalent of one of their quarters of North American revenue. Q1 North American revenue was about that much. So that would be wiped off according to them based on what they're expecting to lose out on this year. So the final leg of the stool, folks, is commerce. Andrew, why have you included this leg of the stool with users and with revenue, and what are your concerns there or thoughts around this leg?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's all about data, right? What the disruption that Meta has encountered has to do with data loss for both targeting and measurement. And as Debbie mentioned, they have unbelievable AI and machine learning, and they're working hard to use the data signals that they do still have in order to fine tune their advertising systems. And they're making progress, right? It's a very smart company. There's no doubt they're going to help be able to plug at least some of that hole. But how much they can plug that current gap, I think, depends on that data quality. So they need more first-party data. That commerce piece has to play an increasing role. And people are doing more social commerce purchasing. Facebook has tried to get, with direct checkout on both Facebook and Instagram, more of that activity. The question I have is, how much do they need? I mean, how much activity is there that's truly happening with those signals? My sense is that social commerce is still generally pretty intermittent purchases. It's thin data, it's commerce data, it's useful signal, but it's still intermittent enough that I just don't know how much of the gap that it fills.
Mm-hmm. Debbie, what's your take on this leg of the stool?
Yeah, my take is that this leg of the stool is pretty short. I'm imagining that it's leaning over in one direction, and that is commerce. Commerce is very small, I think, on Facebook compared to the other two legs of the stool in terms of its contribution to Meta's. I call it Facebook, but we're really talking about Meta in the contribution to Meta's success as an advertising platform. If you just look at one data source, for example, the Tenuity data that I just referenced. So Tenuity says that So one form of advertising that is related to shopping on Meta's platforms is Instagram shop ads. And these shop ads were released globally in August of 2021. They accounted for 1% of Instagram ad impressions for Tenuity in Q1. So very, very small ad business, which I think means very, very small, commerce business at this point. The advertisers, I think, are interested in it. And certainly Meta is talking it up, but Meta is also being realistic. I mean, they've said on their earnings call that this is a small opportunity right now. It's an early stage opportunity. What Meta really is wanting to talk up at this moment is the click to messaging ads, which is essentially an ad format that appears on Facebook or Instagram that lets you then click over or move over to a WhatsApp or a Facebook Messenger to interact or engage with a retailer. So they revealed, which I thought was interesting on the earnings call, that click to messaging is a multi-billion-dollar ad business growing at double digits. Which I did not know. That is new information that I don't think that they've talked about before. So they are really focusing on that in the near term. The midterm, I think, is going to be these shopping ads that are very small at this point. And then, the long term, we'll see. But the long term is really, to Andrew's point, getting more people to engage in commerce on Facebook, on Instagram directly without clicking over to the retailer's site. And that's a big if.
Debbie, I also noticed the click to message. They talked about that a few times. And my take on that was it probably happens in a fairly decent volume and it's a pretty meaningful conversion signal. I mean, the visibility into conversions is what's been lost with iOS. And I just don't think that the purchases that we're talking about with social commerce they're probably just much, much smaller in volume than some of those other conversion metrics. So how they rebuild is based on using whatever they have that helps show that something is converting. And if it isn't the purchase, then you look for the next best thing.
Well, on that point, though, I just want to toss in that another thing that Meta is really trying to talk up is their Conversions API tool. Not to get too technical, but essentially the Conversions API tool is about a year old under this name, but the basics of the tool have been around for longer, and it basically helps link website events and offline conversion data with information that Meta has. So essentially what Meta is trying to do is get retailers and advertisers to, in a privacy safe way, and I'm using air quotes, in a privacy safe way is what they're saying, to provide their data to Meta to be able to allow these retailers, advertisers to then track conversions back on their site. This tool has been really talked up, but it's also been problematic. There are some major partners like Shopify that have been, some of their own partners are not as interested in using this Conversions API tool. It's not an easy sell. So this is another challenge I think that Meta has is, while it's trying to build up first-party data and its own first-party conversions to shopping, it's also trying to ask its retail and advertising partners to use the Conversions API tool, to not always huge success. So that's a big deal. And I think we need to pay attention to the uptake of Conversions API as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's all we've got time for the show. It's time now for the post-game report. So, Andrew, I'll start with you, and then we'll go to Debbie. A takeaway from the show, and also just wrapped up in that takeaway or separate, just a thought on what you're expecting the coming quarters, Q2, Q3, Q4, the rest of the year to kind of look like for Meta. Should we be very concerned, moderately concerned, kind of looking at from out of the corner of our eye and paying some slight attention to it? What are your thoughts with regards to a takeaway?
We've run through the three legs of the stool, and I would say I think all three of them are very wobbly. So that doesn't bode well, but let me provide some potential upside. Never underestimate a smart company with the resources and machine learning that Facebook or Meta has at its disposal. But I'll say the upside to reverse one of those trends, I think, is on the usage trends, and specifically with Reels on Instagram. If you think about how addictive that feature has been on TikTok, in some sense, co-opting that feature, and this can create a rising tide that lifts other boats. It's not always a zero-sum game. We tend to talk about TikTok only in sort of usurping time spent from Facebook and Instagram. I think there's potential that this helps improve engagement, time spent, get it going in the right direction. So that could maybe help make at least one of the legs of the stool more sturdy.
Mm-hmm. And Debbie, a takeaway from you and your kind of outlook on the Meta's short-term future, at least?
Yeah, sure. The short-term future is video, as Andrew points out. I mean, video is already huge on Facebook and Instagram. Reels is growing. It faces a huge challenge from TikTok, but I wouldn't discount Meta's ability to, pull out all the stops to make Reels a success. I think it needs to do that. And I think that video contributes to time spent. I mean, the more time, long videos are getting longer. I think Instagram just said Reels can now be 90 seconds. So if you're watching a 90-second Reel a couple times a day, that's adding up to minutes. And so that is, I think, if they can succeed in getting people to do more of that, that's going to help that time spent metric, which is going to help the DAU metric, which is going to help the revenue, which hopefully then will help Meta then drive people to make purchases on Instagram or Facebook.
Absolutely. Well, after these Q1 earnings, Miss Foreman of the Journal said that Meta's apps may not be as cool as they once were, but they have collectively managed to reach nearly half the world's population on a monthly basis, a record unmatched in social media. But there are some things going on, and we'll be keeping a closer eye on them going forward. That's what we've got time for this episode. Thank you to my guests. Thank you to Debbie.
Thank you, Marcus.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you.
And thanks to Victoria, who edits the show. Thanks to everyone listening in. We'll see you tomorrow for the Behind the Numbers Weekly Listen, an eMarketer podcast made possible by mParticle.